Something bad is happening with the NASA Moon program. Even though the agency has made some really solid progress lately, new reports are pointing to a few critical pieces of hardware that could end up delaying the moon landing if they're not ready in time. So, what exactly are those problems? The development of NASA's next-generation spacesuits hasn't exactly gone smoothly. A report released in April 2026 by the NASA Office of Inspector General points out that the original timelines were simply too optimistic, and at this point, no longer realistic. That's a problem, because NASA is counting on these new suits for its planned 2028 return to the moon. The same report warns that the timeline could now be in serious trouble. Part of the issue is just how outdated the current gear is. The suits astronauts use today for spacewalks on the International Space Station are based on designs that go back decades, with no major upgrades in over 20 years. And the old Apollo moon suits? Those aren't even usable anymore. To move things forward, NASA brought in private companies, Axiom Space and Collins Aerospace, in 2022 to build a new generation of suits for both lunar missions and microgravity use. Instead of owning them outright, NASA planned to essentially rent the suits under contracts worth up to $3.1 billion. But progress has been slow. Collins Aerospace dropped out in 2024 after failing to meet deadlines, leaving Axiom as the only remaining provider. Early plans called for lunar suit demos in 2025 and ISS testing in 2026, but those goals have now slipped far out of reach. And time is tight. NASA still wants to test the microgravity suits before the ISS is retired, currently expected around 2030. At the same time, the suits need to be ready for Artemis 4, the mission aiming to land astronauts on the moon in 2028. One of the biggest headaches right now is integration. The suits have to work seamlessly with other systems, especially the human landing system and the lunar terrain vehicle. The problem is there's no universal standard for how all these pieces should connect. That's already causing conflicts. Blue Origin designed parts of its lunar lander using NASA's reference interface, but Axiom later chose a different approach for how astronauts get in and out of the suit. Now, either the lander has to be redesigned or new hardware has to be built to make everything compatible, both of which could drive up costs. If delays continue, the report warns, the suits might not be ready until 2031. And historically, spacesuits have often been the last thing to fall into place for human spaceflight missions. That raises a bigger question. What ends up being the real bottleneck for a 2028 moon landing? The lander or the suits? Because realistically, a lunar mission without spacewalks isn't much of a mission at all. The report also takes aim at NASA's decision to outsource suit development instead of keeping it in-house, especially given the limited commercial demand for spacesuits. Still, other players are exploring alternatives. Spacex, for example, has been developing its own suit for microgravity and even tested a version for spacewalks during the 2024 Polaris Dawn mission. The company has suggested that the design could eventually be adapted for use on the moon. It would be incredibly cool to see an astronaut walking on the moon in a suit designed by SpaceX. I mean, we've already seen just how sleek and modern spacesuits can look thanks to them, but adapting that design for actual lunar use isn't something that's going to happen quickly. Right now, SpaceX has its hands full with what matters most for NASA's moon program. And yeah, you guessed it, the lunar lander. And that brings us to another major issue that could seriously delay the Artemis program, one that's been getting a lot of attention lately. NASA's strategy for developing these crude lunar landers has actually done a good job keeping costs under control, but the schedule is another story. That's raised some real questions about how quickly NASA can actually move things forward. A recent review looked at how NASA is managing the Human Landing System (HLS) program, which oversees the landers being developed by Blue Origin and SpaceX. The good news is that the use of fixed-price, milestone-based contracts has worked well for controlling costs. SpaceX's contract has only increased by $253 million, or about 6%, since 2021. While Blue Origin's has gone up just $13 million, less than 1% since 2023. According to the report, at least part of those increases came from NASA-requested changes to make everything fit within the broader Artemis architecture. But when it comes to the schedule, both companies are slipping. SpaceX's Starship lander for Artemis 3 is now at least 2 years behind schedule, and more delays are expected. Blue Origin isn't doing much better, with its Blue Moon lander running at least 8 months late compared to its original Artemis 5 timeline. A big part of the problem comes down to one critical technology: cryogenic fluid management. Both companies are struggling with storing and transferring super-cold propellants in space, something that's absolutely essential for their designs. NASA is even tracking this as a top risk, warning that some of SpaceX's cryogenic systems may not be mature in time for Artemis 3. One key test, transferring propellant between 2 starships in orbit, was originally planned for March 2025. That slipped by 12 months to March 2026. And now it looks like SpaceX won't hit that date either. The next Starship launch, expected no earlier than next month, won't even include that test. Looking ahead, there's a critical design review in August 2026, followed by an uncrewed landing test by the end of 2026. On the Blue Origin side, there are still major design issues to work through. After a preliminary design review in 2024, nearly half of the required fixes were still unresolved as of August 2025, more than a year later. The company still needs to reduce the vehicle's mass, improve its propulsion system, and increase propellant margins. There are also some broader concerns about both lander designs. For example, Starship's crew cabin sits about 35 meters above the lunar surface, meaning astronauts will rely on an elevator to get down and back up. That's considered a top risk, because right now there's no backup plan if that system fails. NASA and SpaceX are also not fully aligned on whether Starship meets the requirement for manual control during landing, something that was standard during the Apollo missions. And then there's the issue of engine plumes. When these landers touch down, they could kick up a lot of dust and debris, potentially interfering with sensors or even damaging the spacecraft. When it comes to how these missions will actually work, both companies are using pretty complex refueling architectures. SpaceX's plan involves using a Starship as a propellant depot in low Earth orbit, filled by more than 10 tanker launches carrying liquid oxygen and methane. These tankers would launch roughly every 6 days, starting more than 200 days before the crew even lifts off. Once the depot is full, the lander would refuel in orbit, head to a near rectilinear halo orbit around the Moon, and wait there, giving NASA about 100 days to launch Orion and dock for the landing mission. Blue Origin's approach is similar, but uses a system called a transporter, launched on New Glenn and filled with liquid oxygen and hydrogen. The Blue Moon lander would refuel in low Earth orbit, travel to the gateway, and then top off again before the crew arrives on Orion. That said, all of these plans could still change. NASA asked both companies last fall to come up with ways to speed things up, but so far, no details have been released. According to the report, it's still too early to understand the technical, financial, or schedule impact of those proposals. As of February 27th, Artemis 3 is now planned as a low Earth orbit mission where Orion docks with the landers, targeting mid-2027. Then come 2 actual lunar landing attempts, Artemis 4 in early 2028 and Artemis 5 in late 2028. Even with those updates, the report makes one thing clear. NASA needs to properly test these landers in realistic, flight-like conditions, a principle known as test like you fly. Right now, the concern is that upcoming uncrewed tests won't fully exercise all systems or replicate a complete mission profile. All right, let's wrap this up on a more positive note, because not everything in the Artemis program is falling behind. Following the successful Artemis 2 test flight around the Moon, NASA has made some solid progress on the hardware side. One big milestone? The rollout of the core stage, the largest part of the Space Launch System (SLS) rocket that will carry astronauts on Artemis 3 in 2027. This massive stage recently left NASA's Michoud Assembly Facility in New Orleans and is now on its way to Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Engineers carefully moved the top 4/5 of the core stage, which includes the liquid hydrogen tank, liquid oxygen tank, intertank, and forward skirt, onto the Pegasus barge for transport. Once it arrives at Kennedy, teams will finish outfitting it and begin stacking the full rocket as part of final launch preparations. When fully assembled, the core stage will stand 212 feet tall, about 64.6 meters. It holds more than 733,000 gallons of super-chilled propellant, around 2.77 million liters, to feed 4 RS-25 engines. During launch, it'll burn for over 8 minutes and generate more than 2 million pounds of thrust, roughly 8.9 meganewtons, enough to send the Orion spacecraft and its crew into orbit. Speaking of Orion, things are looking pretty good there too. After traveling 694,481 miles, about 1.12 million kilometers, around the moon and back, initial inspections showed the spacecraft performed exactly as expected, with no major issues. One of the biggest improvements came from the heat shield. Compared to Artemis 1, the amount of char loss was significantly reduced, both in size and quantity, and it matched what engineers predicted from ground testing. NASA also captured airborne imagery of Orion during re-entry, which will help teams better understand exactly when and how that minor char loss occurred. The crew module is expected to return to Kennedy Space Center this month, where it'll go through detailed inspections. Engineers will analyze flight data, remove reusable components like avionics, and clear out any remaining hazards, such as leftover fuel and coolant. Later this summer, the heat shield will be sent to Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama for deeper analysis, including sample extraction and internal X-ray scans to better understand how the materials performed under real flight conditions. There is one issue still under investigation: a problem with the urine vent line during the Artemis II mission. Teams are currently working to find the root cause and make sure it's fully resolved before Artemis 3. On the ground systems side, there's more good news. After the Artemis 2 launch, engineers carried out a full inspection of the launch pad and mobile launcher, and overall, things held up really well. Thanks to upgrades made after Artemis 1, the pad sustained only minimal damage despite the intense forces from liftoff. Some components were reinforced, like elevator doors, while others were redesigned to flex and absorb the blast, like parts of the gas distribution system. Critical systems, including pneumatics and cooling water flows, remained fully operational after launch, which is a big win. The mobile launcher has since been moved back to the Vehicle Assembly Building at Kennedy, where it'll undergo some repairs and get prepped for future Artemis missions. So yeah, while there are definitely challenges ahead, especially with the landers, it's clear that other parts of the program are making real, steady progress.